Man, this week has been nuts. GPT-5 is frankly the best model in the world at that point, in particular in coding, agentic tasks. I feel for the first time like it's both a PhD in my pocket. It is way more intelligent than I am. Having the model being able to achieve that kind of performance, mind-blowing. The overarching design goal of GPT-5 for ChatGPT was to give the general population access to the best model without having to think about it. I think Sam tweeted, GPT-5 in the API went to 2 billion tokens per minute in about 1 hour or 2 hours.
That is insane.
Keeping a level of availability latency for that kind of ramp, it's truly hardcore engineering.
What do you think the world maybe looks like a few years from now once this first inning has been played out?
If I were to try to paint a trend, we're going towards abstractions, which are in a way more and more intuitive to humans. Buckle up, the next few years are going to be super exciting.
I'm really excited for this conversation. I have Olivier Godement, who is the head of product platform at OpenAI. Olivier, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. I'm so glad to have a chance to chat with you.
So it's been a huge week at OpenAI. We're recording on a Friday. I think Monday or Tuesday, the open source models came out, and been less than 24 hours, I think, since GPT-5 came out. It's been a huge week. For folks who are maybe having trouble keeping on top of everything coming out of OpenAI, can you tell us what's really exciting about both the open source models and GPT-5 as well?
Yeah, it's been an amazing week. So glad to meet you all, frankly. I'm Olivier. I run the platform and the business products at OpenAI. Been at OpenAI for a couple of years. AI, the AI industry and OpenAI in particular have been pretty intense, for the past couple of years. Man, this week has been nuts. There have been two, I would say the overarching story is that OpenAI launched basically the two frontier, open and closed models in the past 4 days. If I start chronologically, we shipped two GPT open weight model that we call GPT OSS on Tuesday. Those come in two sizes, a small model and a medium-sized model. Those are incredibly powerful models that can do reasoning, that can do structured outputs, all the features that businesses and developers need. And the thing which really blows up my mind on GPT open weights is that those models can fit on consumer hardware, on consumer devices. So the idea of being able to run that level of intelligence on a laptop, on a phone, is just opens up so many possibilities. So number one, the open weights model. Number two, GPT-5. We shipped GPT-4 a little more than 2 years ago, which was a huge step function. GPT-5 is another huge step function that direction. GPT-5 is frankly, I think, the best model in the world at that point, in particular in coding, agentic tasks. It hallucinates less. I feel for the first time it's both a PhD in my pocket. It is way more intelligent than I am. It knows a lot, true subject matter expertise, but also it's really useful. And that's something I would love to share with you guys. We've been spending so much time talking with customers, developers, businesses, to really make the model more reliable, accurate, useful in real world conditions. That I expect it's going to enable many more new use cases, real world use cases of AI to pop up.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about both models and how they compare to each other. By both models, I mean the open source and GPT-5. The open source model has been out for 4 or 5 days now. GPT-5 has been out for about 24 hours, but obviously there's customers who've had early access here. What are some really interesting use cases you've seen with both GPT-5 and the open source models in the time that customers have been using it?
Yeah, for GPT-5, I think the two use cases which have struck me the most for the past few weeks. Number one is around coding. Coding is probably the biggest market of AI at the moment after the general consumer chatbots. And we've seen a real inflection in the kind of projects, tasks that GPT-5 coding models can do. Give an example. We've worked quite a bit with Cursor, the code editor, the AI code editor. And it's funny, Michael told us, the first time, he tried, Michael, the CEO, the first time he tried GPT-5, the first thing he threw at GPT-5 was not a sort of a just generate like tons of lines of code, but like a complex architectural systems questions around their code base. So something that requires not just like to churn like, as many characters as you can, but something that requires a deep understanding over a pretty big amount of information. And GPT-5 was, way above like other models to solve that kind of really hard questions. And when I think about the best engineers and scientists in general, which have had like the opportunity to work with, um, I think that really reminds you of them. Like they're not just like super quick and can churn a ton of code in a day, but they have that deeper systems understanding. And so yeah, having the model being able like to achieve that kind of performance, mind blowing. So that's on coding. The second kind of use cases I've really come to appreciate over the past few weeks are around like deep critical industries such as like healthcare, life sciences, finance that requires a high level of accuracy, a high level of reasoning, and being able to go out of the classic like coding math distribution into like other industries. To give you two stories, the first one is I've worked quite a bit with Amgen. Amgen is a US company that designs medicines for cancers, inflammatory diseases, so pretty tough like diseases. And so they see GPT-5 and like future models as really an accelerant for their scientist teams. Like their scientist team has to go through like hundreds of pages of scientific literature, clinical data, and so having a teammate like GPT-5 has been like a really good like accelerant as we see in the past few weeks. Another example more on the commercial side is BBVA. BBVA is one of the top banks in Europe. It's a bank from Spain, but all across the world. And they've been using GPT-5 for like pretty complex like financial analysis. Think about helping your customers, your clients, like think about all the work like geopolitical, financial risk, and coming up with options on where to invest money, or and GPT-5 has seen like a step function again in terms of accuracy, speed. Two examples, but the reality is, I've seen that a couple of times at that point at OpenAI. We are going to be surprised in the coming weeks and months. Every time there is a step function in model capabilities and speed and accessibility, new use cases emerge. What I'm telling my teams, I think pretty much every week at that point, is I think the vast majority of demand of AI is currently bottlenecked on intelligence, capabilities, like, availability. And so every time like we unlock like, new capabilities, new capacity, we're going to see new use cases that we didn't think, were out there.
Yeah, that's an excellent insight. You obviously talked about code gen, which initially Hassan is technical, I'm non-technical, so it's always interesting to compare notes. Initially, I saw like tools like Cursor and so on, and I said, you know what, this is too technical. This isn't for me. I tried to learn how to use Cursor with LLMs. Wasn't really my thing. But then obviously we started to see tools like Lovable and Bolt and Replit and all these other ones. That was for me as a non-technical user, that kind of was the aha moment for me. But even then, I realized like I'm seeing like this barbell thing right now where on like one end, it's like technical or semi-technical people are using tools like Cursor or Lovable. And then, like there's on the other end, there's like non-technical people who want to build apps, but maybe they're building mini apps that aren't really stable, secure, or scalable, if you can call them. Do you feel like we're there yet? And if not, when do you think we really reach a point where something that is like production ready and scalable becomes available to the mass public?
I love the barbell analogy. I'm seeing both like the most cracked engineers I know, like being accelerated by AI, and also like people who don't have like any like engineering background, who are coming up with like pretty decent like apps, web apps, for their daily lives and as games. If I were to zoom out, I think one of the lessons for me like of technology over the past like 10, 20 years is there is a massive software shortage in the world. Like if I were to zoom out like, a million miles, at the end of the day, like everyone want to have like super custom tools, like, for their own specific use cases on your level of like proficiency. if I'm talking about like education tools, like, I have a very specific way to learn new concept, like others have a different one. And so in a way, the current, like, one size fits all, like paradigm is frankly like mostly, I would say, an artifact of, how difficult it is like to build like a new application. Everyone who's been like, writing software for the past 10 years would realize like, like building something, scaling it to like many more customers is very hard. And so, the idea of like, having like customization across like, millions of people, like, just bubbles up the complexity of the problem. And so my hunch, is massive software shortage. And so I expect that we're going to see like way more applications, including like custom applications, like N of one or, customized to a company and enterprise over the coming years. The second thing I've seen is, pretty much like every single like technological like revolution, like includes at some point like some games or toys, like, what we would see as like, not serious apps. But they're really like, the tip of the iceberg, right? They're, fun to do. You can do a fun app like in 5 minutes. But what we've seen with the coding tools that you mentioned, like, Cursor, Lovable, like, JetBrains, we've worked frankly with every single of them, like over the past, like, month, is the magnitude of the adoption in the enterprise and, in businesses is really, really fast. I think we've long reached the point where, if I were to tell all engineers, like, in the world, like, hey, you cannot use like Cursor codecs anymore, like, there would be a massive revolt, frankly. And so I think the world impact is already here. And at the same time, I think we're just touching like, we're scratching the surface because of that, massive like software shortage in the world.
Yeah, and I just have a question here, which may not make sense later. So Olivier, like you mentioned this, customization of software, and Sam Altman obviously tweeted about the fashion era of salad as well. Where do you think, like, what is, in your opinion, the key blocker today for adoption of this customization of software, right? Like, is that cost? Is it people just don't really fully understand how to use products like GPT-5? Is it that, something else? Just curious to know your thoughts there.
I think there are 2 or 3 main blockers to massive adoption. The number one, frankly, is very mundane, but like cost and compute. Like the world doesn't have enough compute at the moment to enable like, adoption by 8 billion people of AI. And so that's something that we at OpenAI have been working on pretty aggressively over the past few years. But, until we as a society, like, build up the infrastructure, the energy, like, to, blanket the world with compute, it's going to be hard, like, to get to that world. That's number one, cost and compute. Number two, and that one is being resolved like much faster, is what is the native form factor of AI products, right? What does it mean to enable an employee in the finance department to build their own workflow, their own tool, even if they don't have like a development background? And so here, I think the tools like, Codex, Cursor, Lovable have been doing like amazingly well, like, at finding like the right level of interface, the right level of details that you expose to a user, depending on what they want, for them to be able to achieve, their outcome. That's number two. Number three is, even though like, GPT-5 is a massive step forward, I think like we still, have ways to go on like, getting to full like accuracy, reliability, zero hallucinations. We're getting there, frankly, given the pace of progress over the past like couple of years. I think like, we clearly have a sort of an end goal in sight. But yeah, I think once you combine like all these factors, the models are like, 5 nines accurate. The form factor is like perfect for everyone with different level of proficiency. And you have enough compute. I think at that point, we'll live like in a different world from a software perspective.
I want to come back a little bit to the open source stuff because I know GPT-5 is so exciting. It's, I think maybe the open source is getting left behind a little bit in all of like the news. So if you're a developer right now, you have the option to choose between GPT-5 and the open source models. Besides maybe, differences in cost, how do you think developers should be evaluating the choice between both sets of models?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think of the open source models as really useful for 2 main use cases. Number one, frankly, is we want developers and researchers to tinker with the models. Like the reason why we release the weights is for people to be able to do whatever they want in terms of fine-tuning, full parameter fine-tuning, customization. If the open source like AI, like history is a good teacher, we're going to see like many interesting fine-tunes, like, emerge in the coming weeks and months. So that's number one. Like, by definition, when you have the weights, you can do like, as much customization as you want on the model. The second one, which is a bit more like, a bit less obvious or, like until you talk with customers, is the whole like on-premise privacy, like, full privacy use cases. When you talk to extremely demanding customers such as governments, banks, life sciences company, as well as, companies that operate in the real world where, connectivity can be an issue, capacity can be an issue. Like, you realize that I expect AI deployment is going to be hybrid between closed source and open source. I think if you look at Twitter, like it tends to be like, extremely polarized on like, all open, no open, etc. The reality is that when you talk with like, large deployments, it's hybrid. So if like to a bank, like, some of their core banking data, like, is on premise, really hard to move to the cloud. And so open source makes sense. But at the same time, they want to get access to like the latest and greatest without having to stand up like inference infrastructure, which is freaking hard. And so, it's a mix. And so a few days in, what I'm seeing is, people in the government and the enterprise, like really experimenting like way faster than before. Because, that bypasses like all the complex, like, cloud, like, underwriting processes. And I'm seeing also like, developers, researchers, hackers, really dissecting the model to try to, get the best of it for their specific use cases.
Yeah. So Olivier, like the first question I want to ask is, as I looked at GPT-5, it seemed like it is kind of like architecturally like a router model, between a Bayes and reasoning model, or not like a hybrid between reasoning and Bayes. Just curious to know, like, what was the reason to pick that now for GPT-5, and a bit you can share on that.
Yeah, totally. The answer depends. The answer depends on ChatGPT versus the API. For ChatGPT, GPT-5 is a unified system. The overarching design goal of GPT-5 for ChatGPT was to give the general population access to the best model without having to think about it. I'm sure, like, the three of us and many people listening to the podcast are like, super deep into AI. And so they understood the differences between the different models, reasoning, non-reasoning, they wanted to test. But the reality is that the immense majority of the population, like, just uses the default. And frankly, like, I don't blame them. Like, you shouldn't have to think. And so for GPT-5, what we did is, there is essentially a router, and depending on the question of the user, we pick the best model, essentially based on like intelligence and speed of the query. And so behind the scenes, like GPT-5 essentially is a mix of, multiple GPT-5 reasoning and chat models. In the API, when we work with developers, enterprises, those are super sophisticated and they know their stuff. Like, they know exactly, where to place the cursor on the intelligence speed curve. And so what we did is that we essentially post-trained and designed 3 different models in the API, a large one, a mini one, and a nano one. Those have like, fairly different like cost latency profiles, but they're all like quite intelligent.
No, I think that I think people love it in ChatGPT. Like as you said, like if you don't have the understanding of what the model is useful for, like just go with the default. But like you guys providing the routing would be very critical.
Totally. Like, in the industry, like the three of us and everyone has been talking like reasoning models, like, for a year, like how amazing they are, sometimes or like, magical they are. I think 99% of the population, like, have never tried like reasoning models. They're still like on Poro or, whatever like the default models are in,
Poro is awesome. Like it does everything, right?
Exactly. And so, yeah, I think yesterday, like, frankly, we increased like, like the bar of intelligence for like many, many people overnight. And so, yeah, frankly, that's at the end of the day, what OpenAI is about. So I'm pretty proud of that decision.
So let's talk about a bit about like, the OpenAI's approach around building these models, right? Like you obviously see GPT 4.0 came out, like you have new reasoning models coming out and open source models coming out. And these are like key changes. And for someone sitting outside, they may not really fully appreciate how much effort goes into taking from GPT-3 to like where we sit today. So if you can kind of talk about like how you guys think about research, engineering inside, how these processes work, I think people will love that.
I will say, like, the past couple of years has been like, heroic effort across many, many different functions and craft. we often talk about, pre-training and scaling, and, that's happening, like, having to train, like, and scale, like, new base models. Something that we talk, I think we should talk as much is on what we call post-training, which is essentially like teaching the model the core capabilities and behavior that are useful to people. And that's really as much of an art as it is a science. And by art, what I mean is, it requires to be very, very close to customers, understanding, okay, you want to use AI models to automate some customer support queries. What does that mean? How many steps? How much should the model respond like right off the bat versus asking more clarification questions? And so we talk a lot here on like model design or model behavior design. And I think the word design is actually very well chosen. Like it is like a design, essentially function. Something which has been incredibly humbling as well over the past month and years has been the work of the inference and infrastructure teams. The inference engineers are probably some of the most like underrated, like, experts in the AI field. The level of complexity of networking together dozens of thousands of GPUs, making them run at the same time, like squeezing every single flops, like floating point operation, serving like, in a second, a complex query is absolutely huge, especially when you see that, the demand on the customer business side is, rising and rising. Like if you had told me like, a couple of years ago, like I think Sam tweeted GPT-5 in the API went to 2 billion tokens per minute in about like 1 hour or 2 hours. It's even hard for me who spent like their day, like, in this to even visualize what 2 billion tokens per minute. Like keeping like a level of like availability latency for that kind of ramp. It's truly, truly, truly hardcore engineering. Yeah, I think all of this work, has been quite instrumental to get to the point where we are. And, we often like see, like, we often think of like, the research effort of OpenAI as the work of like, a lone scientist with like a genius idea. And there are some of those, there are some genius ideas, but frankly, behind the scenes, like, it's all little things, the care, the craft on like every single part of the stack, every single model behavior. Like, how much do you want the model to generate tables or, plain text answers? Like, how much do you want the model to be short or, verbose? All these little details like matter so much. I mean, we're talking about intelligence. Like, it is a very multidimensional problem. And so, yeah, I've been frankly truly humbled to be a small part of that journey.
No, it's amazing. I think like the amount of demand, like 1 billion tokens in like less than an hour, that is crazy. Like that's like millions most probably of queries happening, and that is insane in the first hour. One kind of follow up on there, right? Like for folks who may not appreciate a lot about engineering and research who might be listening to this podcast, how does like OpenAI's kind of like idea generation process to like production work? Like, is it like a research team kind of like figuring it out, and then there's an engineering team? Like, how does like, simply ideas show up in production?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the answer has evolved quite a bit over the years. OpenAI initially was a research lab. So, there were only researchers. Researchers who had a deep conviction that deep learning was able to scale and solve like more and more useful problems. And so I think historically, like, essentially like those ideas like came exclusively from the research side. Many of the ideas still come from the research side. But the thing which has changed over the past couple of years is that we now have pretty massive adoption of AI in the real world. Like we see AI being adopted, like we talked about coding, but frankly, coding is like, one of many in like education, life sciences, like all of them. And so therefore we see like we have a much better venture into what are like the next unblocks for models to solve useful problems. And as a result, like I would say, like, we have built like a pretty cool like feedback loop over the past couple of years, essentially to work with some of the most ambitious and sophisticated customers, I was mentioning Abgen, I was meeting with Abgen literally yesterday to sit with our scientists and be like, okay, guys, what are the next unblocks? When you design a new drug, what is complicated, what is still what is easier, on what dimension should the model be slightly better, and that would have an outsized impact, on your business. And so I think more and more of the ideas are coming from customers themselves, and then we try to work backward with engineering research in order to solve those problems. OpenAI, initial superpower was its research, excellent, and the intensity of the culture on the research side. And I think that's still the case. I think the second superpower that people are not, sometimes overseeing is frankly that super tight feedback loop between customers and research. Because frankly, we are laser focused on the mission of distributing AGI broadly. We are trying essentially to identify and select the most important problems to work on, and then to work backwards as much as we can solve them.
No, I think the domain knowledge, understanding, and the relationship between research and engineering has become so much more critical as models have advanced. And at the end of the day, you're trying to solve real world problems, and you need that interactions. Awesome to hear that the relationship OpenAI has built and the impact you're having in critical spaces like drug discovery, which are so important in the long run for human race as well. One kind of question I had is that, if I'm a developer today, I'm building on the app layer, how should I be thinking about some of the opportunities GPT-5 unlocks, which maybe 3 months, 4 months ago were not viable? Obviously, we talked about Amgen, we talked about a large financial institution in Spain as well. But if I'm just a small company, a startup, what should I be focused on?
I think from a small startup or an indie developer perspective, I think there are two major innovations which are most interesting. Number one is the jump in agentic capabilities. And let me, disentangle that. The second thing, which are going to come later, is the drop in price, in cost and latency. And both are equally important from my perspective. Agentic. Essentially, what we want to do is we want models to be able to do stuff for us, right? And stuff means not only quickly answering questions, that's useful, but doing actual stuff in the real world. I want to buy a ticket, the model goes on for a few seconds, a few minutes, I want to generate a slide deck for my next meeting, the model goes on, and generates a PowerPoint. So if you decompose, what does doing stuff in the real world mean? I think there are at least two capabilities which are needed. Number one is what we call long horizon tasks. So the model has to be able to go on for 1 minute, 5 minutes, 20 minutes, and being reliable, not going off rails. And the previous models, had a tendency to go, much more off rails. They were reliable for a few steps, but after a few turns, they were starting to drift in a wrong direction. And GPT-5 is by far the model which is the most likely essentially to be accurate and reliable for these long horizon tasks. So that's part one of agentic tasks.
Before we go to the prices thing, I wanna have a follow up, because trajectory is so critical, right? If you can keep the model on trajectory, it is insane. So how does GPT-5 kind of improve the frontier here on the trajectory control, especially for agentic tasks?
Yeah, it's a mix of higher intelligence and more complete data on long horizon trajectory. One benchmark which I like a lot is the new Tau Square bench. Maybe for people who are not spending their days nerding on benchmarks, it's basically an evaluation, a benchmark which is focused on super realistic customer support queries. And if I call my airline company with customer support, it's not going to be just a one interaction. Refund me and they're yes, here's the money. It's going to be, hey, what is your name? Where do you want to travel? Why do you want a refund? Do you want to book something else? It's really multi-turn, and it, requires the customer support agent to go look in different systems, are there the real Olivier or someone else? And so that benchmark essentially models that kind of interactions across a few different industries, and so we've been really focused on making the model perform really well on those benchmarks. And the benchmark was released, I think 2 or 3 months ago. And GPT-5 basically already saturates like the benchmark, like, hits essentially the highest score.
No, I think that's amazing. I think because that as a developer, that's really exciting. And then I think the second thing we were talking about pricing, and as a developer, the prices have considerably come down. And I was like, when I was looking at the pricing, I was like, holy shit. A lot of their competitors would have to really rethink what they will be pricing these products at. But is this a new normal now?
Oh, it's not only the new normal, it's going to go further, even lower. I think the real world use of AI is very much bottlenecked on cost still. On one hand, I'm completely mind blown. If you look at like GPT-4 like 2 years ago, I think the price of GPT-4 was probably something like 20x or 25x, like, higher than GPT-5 at release. So, that's how far we come. Like the model is like meaningfully smarter and like more capable and like 25x cheaper than what seems to be like a truly like superhuman like model 2 years ago. But still, like, if you want to use AI and customize the experience on your front page, and that front page is seen by millions, billions of people, frankly the models are still too expensive, and we know that. And so the teams are working very hard, both like to compress more and more intelligence to smaller and smaller models, and to make the whole like inference systems that I mentioned earlier, like, that capacity to utilize like GPUs as much as we can, like more and more efficient. And so my intuition is that we have a pretty clear roadmap and line of sight to get even lower.
I think that's music to my ears, and I'm sure all the large companies, small companies will love that. So let me like one thing also I'm curious to know, right? Like OpenAI also now has an app focus. You've brought in like some amazing individual to lead that direction as well. How do you guys are balancing your investments between the app side and the API side moving forward?
OpenAI has a very simple business strategy, like platform with a killer app. The platform, which is what I work on, horizontal, meant to enable like many use cases, across industries, countries, cultures. And then an app, which is much more vertical and targeted at, automating knowledge queries, like, personal assistant, which is ChatGPT, of course. The way I think about it is intelligence and AI are probably some of the most multi-dimensional, multi-use case problems that we are going after, right? When you think of it, like, models are being used today to help me figure out what should I shop and cook tonight, for a scientist to design a new drug, for an engineer, like, to come up with a new feature, like the number of use cases essentially, which, the models are being used and, needs to be good for, is frankly getting like larger and larger. And so there is just no way that, one company, even with, the best like people in the world, is going to be able to provide like the best, like, product for every single of these use case. And so the mission of OpenAI is to distribute AGI broadly. And what that means to me personally is that I want every person, every corner of the world, every industry to have access to an absolute magical experience, whatever that means for them, and that may mean something very different to an engineer in France or, in the Bay Area, to someone, who's like, want to get like some health queries done, like, in India or so on. And so it's very core, like, to OpenAI mission to essentially enable developers and businesses to invent that future for their communities, for their industries. And so if you step back, the API was the first product that OpenAI released back in 2020. And I think that's for a reason. Like, like the whole, like, purpose of OpenAI was to essentially not to keep that intelligence for ourselves, but to actually distribute it broadly and to let like inventors, tinkerers, creators across the world to, figure out what is the best materialization of that intelligence. And so we'll keep investing heavily like in that platform.
One, you mentioned like earlier in the conversation, right? Like in the first hour, you saw like billion tokens consumed. I was always very curious, right? Like you always see these hardware companies talk about like, hey, I'm launching a new phone, and these many new sales happen. People are moving over from X phone to like a next model.
Yeah.
Within the context of new models, like how much of the traffic from 4.0 you see move to 5? And then what is the net new traffic coming in? Do you guys track that internally? Is that something you look at?
Almost overnight. I've never seen that.
Wow.
I've been working in platforms like, for a long time. Usually, when you talk about like APIs, models, like it takes weeks, months for people to migrate. Like those are critical systems which are being
Yeah.
in production. But at the moment, again, we are so bottlenecked as a humanity on intelligence that whatever a model is better, and better can mean more capable, cheaper, like, many dimensions, people are moving extremely fast to new models. Uh, um, like truly, like, the curve which I mentioned, like 2 billion TPM, like, tokens per minute after a couple of hours. I would never imagine a different industry, but here, like the rate of like shifting migration is absolutely huge. And even something I wanted to mention, like, startups, enterprises as well. Like we often see the enterprise world as, super slow. It takes 1 year or two to do anything, maybe in some use cases. But those enterprises have, realized like, how much like, upside there is there. And so we're seeing like, fairly big, like Fortune 500 companies move really fast, like to the new models, which is pretty cool to see.
Yeah, that's a very cool insight. I never really thought about that because we're not platform people, right? So yeah, when I think about it, like just shift overnight from one platform to the next is genuinely surprising. Um, I want to zoom out a little bit from the world of like tokens and APIs to a higher level, like what's going on with AI, where maybe we're heading a little bit. I think a lot about the idea of uh abstraction and how the more we can abstract technology, the more leverage you unlock for individuals and society and so on. So for folks who are listening who might not be familiar with the idea of abstraction, 50 years ago, maybe the most powerful thing the average person could do with the button was maybe like a calculator, like you do some simple calculation, so on. Then we got the computer, then we got the internet. So, with the press of a button, you could access so many applications and all the knowledge and everything. With AI, we're on the cusp of that moment where with the press of a button, we can build apps. Hopefully soon we'll be able to deploy them at scale as well. Uh, how much, what does like a truly abstracted version of AI look like in the world? I know that OpenAI is also reportedly working on a device right now with GenAI coming in. We're seeing models get better and better at abstraction. Like, 2 years ago, AI couldn't even generate an image and we had those full spaghetti moments. Now we're seeing, short films, we're seeing full apps going into deployment. Do you have any, have you given the subject any thought? What do you think the world maybe looks like a few years from now once this first inning has been played out?
It's an excellent question. If you look at history of technology for the past 50 years, I fully agree. Abstraction on top of abstraction on top of abstractions. If you wanted to do anything 50 years ago, you had to understand transistors and, physical, like, mainline, like computers. Um, if you zoom back, like 30 years ago, then, you start to understand like assembly language. Then you had like, more abstracted, like, primary languages. And then we came up with like, the GUI at Xerox PARC, like the graphical UI. Like, if I were to like try to paint like a trend, which is like, we're going towards abstractions, which are in a way like more and more intuitive to humans. Like it's not intuitive to human to have to understand like, how does a transistor work and, how to replace one when, one is, has been shut off. It's quite intuitive to human, like, to start to see images and, oh, there is like a small icon, which is a trash. Like maybe that means something. It's even more like intuitive to human to just talk, I have a son like a 4-year-old, like, they know how to talk pretty quickly, it comes like, quite naturally. And so I think like the general arc is, frankly, towards like less and less learning like curve essentially, or learning cliff, and more towards something which is extremely like, intuitive. And so if you were to, try to paint, some what that might look like, when you look around us at the way computers work, there is in a way like still a lot which is not supernatural.
Yeah.
Like, I was not born to understand what an app is, what, to download something on the store and, I don't know, to log in. Like, that's something I had to learn, And, it does seem fine now, but, still it's something you have to learn. Similarly, like, the fact that you have to use like so many different devices, like for different use cases, like, I use my phone, like to call my car, OS, like, to put some music in my car. My doctor use something else, like, to check my eyes. Like, again, like, something like each of those, like, individuals had to learn like specific tools. And so if I had to make a guess, I think many of those form factors, those abstractions, are probably going to get reinvented, over the next few years. And that reinvention, I think, will probably include natural language. I think it's getting pretty clear at that point. It's funny, 2 years ago, I still had many skeptics. I'm like, oh, it feels weird to talk to ChatGPT and that's something in language, that's not how I use a computer. But frankly, once you learn it, it can go away, right? I think, that's one. Number two, I think the form factor of the hardware devices is going to evolve quite a bit as well. We talk a lot about robotics as well at OpenAI. I expect that we're on the cusp of a pretty significant expansion of what robots can do. So yeah, buckle up. The next few years are going to be super exciting.
Yeah. Right now, the default interface for a lot of AI applications are people's phones or people's laptops. I know OpenAI is doing a lot of great work on voice. Do you feel like a voice is the ultimate interface, maybe? Or do you think we're going to get even super more abstracted into something like a Neuralink, perhaps?
I don't know if voice is the ultimate interface, but I would say it's one of the most underrated interface. I don't know if it's the case I come from France. We use WhatsApp a lot in France. I receive a ton of voice notes from my friends. And those are people who know how to use computer. But, just a voice note communicates more emotion, more intention, higher, information per second. It's just natural. And the fact is that, we have been used for the past decades to pretty bad voice experience on computers, right? Anytime I saw talk to a computer or device, my intuition was, oh my gosh, it's going to be super lossy, super inaccurate. It was designed for people who don't have a choice, who have some handicap. And so I think that's changing completely with the voice models, where essentially the quality of the voice, the understanding, the emotion understanding is getting pretty high. And so I expect that we're going to see way more voice first applications pop up in the near future. That said, there are many use cases where I don't want to talk to my phone. If I'm talking about sensitive, information, medical stuff, or, I'm in a room with many people, I prefer type, write or something, but be discreet. So yeah, underrated, but I don't expect it's the end of all. I expect there will be other modalities to interact with computers.
Yeah. I've been having this experience while using a lot of different AI products. I use ChatGPT a lot for a lot of things. In fact, since a lot of my work is creating content and writing and doing research and so on, I find that AI models are already AGI level on certain tasks. I know that's not general, that's specific, but it feels that sort of as intelligent as it can get certain tasks. A fun experiment we ran internally at the company is we recently created a post completely with AI. We posted it on socials and it got over 10,000 likes and 1 million impressions. All we did was give the prompt and we did not change anything on that post, and it just did that well. And we were fairly mind blown with that. But increasingly, one thing that I'm noticing is for a lot of tasks, AI can produce an almost infinite amount of code or words. And the real bottleneck I find that no longer for those tasks is the intelligence, but it's really just me and my mental bandwidth, right? There's only so much data, there's only so much code, there's only so much content, words, whatever you want that I can really review within a second and make sure that it looks good. Do you think I'm thinking correctly about me being the bottleneck in this situation? Do you feel like that's going to end up happening for a lot more tasks? And I don't know, maybe is there going to be a reviewer AI at which point I feel like I don't even need to be in this entire process, which is a weird kind of philosophical debate as well. But yeah, I just want to get your general thoughts on, in domains where AI really is human level intelligence or better at this point, what is really the role left for the human, and where is the human's real I guess value add?
My philosophy is that the best AI, the best agent, are going to present the exact right amount of information to humans, not too much, not too few. And I agree with your point. Today, it's often too much still. One of the product innovations and the research innovations I've been super interested in over the past few months has been personalization.
Mm.
Like, I think everyone has a different way to consume information and to learn. Some people like want to get like all the details, understand exactly the nuts and bolts and why. Some people are much more comfortable to delegate and, just need essentially like, one or quick 2 data points. It is deeply personal. And if you've been using ChatGPT in the background for the past, few months, I think we are reaching the stage where, if you and I were to swap our personal ChatGPT accounts, it would feel weird. Like, my ChatGPT at that point was exactly how I learned, like how much I want bullet points, data, like crisp, like, or long, etc. And, I'm sure your ChatGPT behaves like differently. I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. One of the superpowers of these models is to catch all the soft signals, like, in your response, in, the way like you interact with the model to understand better, like, for the next answers, like, how to respond. And so I strongly believe that, over the next couple of years, we're going to see like more and more like super personalized, hyper specific model behavior that will probably solve like most of that, bandwidth, like human bandwidth, like, bottleneck. On the question of augmentation versus like replacement, I mean, it's a question which has been on my mind, like, for quite a bit of time. Frankly, what I'm seeing in the world at the moment is augmentation, like all the way. Like when you talk to companies and, engineers, like they say, we need to build more. Like, we need to build more. People are exhausted, like, building, like, production systems, scaling them is like freaking hard. Like, if I could hire like, 5x, like excellent engineers, like I would want to do it now. At that point, I strongly believe, the case is to, do more with like the same number of people.
So obviously you spent almost a decade at Stripe, which is an iconic company, and you were running platform there. You did a global expansion, and now you're working on OpenAI, which is like an iconic company, like doing something really crazy at the AI layer. What are some like profound differences and similarities you're seeing in the work you were doing the last decade to this decade?
Number one is excellent platform, excellent infrastructures have an outsized impact on the world. Enabling millions of builders, millions of businesses to build something is probably, at the end of the day, what can like increase the GDP the most.
Yeah.
And I think the Stripe founders and equally like, OpenAI founders had a similar intuition, which is when you have like a really powerful technology, like one of the best ways, like, to maximize like the impact of that technology on the world is basically to build like really good tools for people like to use it and to amplify like the impact of the technology. So I would say the belief is, in platform as amplifier is like number one. The second thing, which is quite similar, is I think building products and models for startups, businesses, enterprise is, I think, the most customer-centric craft. Because when you build like, models, tools for, the US government, like the Amgen, like, those businesses, you cannot imagine or, guess what they need. Like, those are very complex organizations with like large scale operations. And so you have to be extremely close to them. So sometimes you have to embed directly like with their teams to really understand like what does it take, like, to take a new technology from, idea, like purchase, to actually, mass scale deployment. And so Stripe taught me that, extreme customer centricity. And, I've been using it quite a bit at OpenAI and, so are my colleagues. What is different? The substance of the OpenAI technologies, at the end of the intelligence. And that is a much more multidimensional problems than like payment and finance. Some dimensions are the same. Like, in payments, like money, like the critical factor is really about trust. Like, you trust like the counterparty essentially, to pay you back. That happens in intelligence as well. Like, do you trust the intelligence to be reliable? But intelligence comes with like different factors. Like, what I mentioned, behavior, personality, like, there is a lot of like intangible, hard to quantify dimensions of intelligence. And that's been new, like, to me at OpenAI. So that's one. The second thing, which has been quite different, is it's hard to overstate how much the engineering behind AI is new, is nascent. Like payments, finance has been built for decades, with like fairly stable, infrastructure, extremely complex, but like fairly stable. Today, if you take a GPU, which is at the end of the day, like the core, engineering unit of inference, we're not yet at like 3 nines of reliability and, utilization for, each of the GPUs. Like we are very much building the plane as we, learn how to use it and scale it. And so, having to think not only about like how is the technology distributed, what is like the form factor, but also like how do you scale the infrastructure has been a really interesting challenge, which has been new to me at OpenAI.
No, it's a very multi-dimensional problem, right? Like you have the API platform issue, infrastructure issue, then the use case issue. There are a lot of things happening. What is like one vertical you're really excited about in the next 6 months or 12 months? You're like, hey, we talk about drug discovery, finance, anything else like you're kind of like, looking forward to, like some of the impact? GPT?
I've been spending a lot of time on medicine and drug discovery. I think it's one of the main bottlenecks to human progress at the moment. Like if you step back over the past decade, there has been like maybe 1 or 2 like major breakthrough like new medicines, which is incredible, saving people's life, like increasing life expectancy. And when you talk to, companies like scientists who are actually building like these new medicines, like the amount of knowledge work, admin work, that goes into like developing and distributing a new medicine is huge. And so at that point, I've gained like a pretty strong conviction that AI models used properly, implemented properly, have the capability to considerably accelerate the design and deployment of new drugs. And then you step back and you realize like, okay, you have like 1 breakthrough a decade at the moment. Agentic was absolutely huge, that kind of scale, like once a decade. What would the world look like if it was like once a year, twice a year, 5 times a year? Like, all the diseases that we sometimes tend to take for granted, all the cancers, all the inflammatory diseases, those at the end of the day, can be solved and will be solved. And, I don't want to wait 2 centuries for that to happen. I want to make that happen in the coming years.
Personalization of drugs and to like specific age population,
We talked earlier about like GDP, etc. Really important. I think AI has the potential to increase life expectancy. And, if I step back, that's probably the one metric I would, optimize for as humanity.
that would be huge. That'll be massive.
I just want to interrupt for 1 second because the interesting thing that I like read recently, I can't remember where I read it, so I apologize to the person who originally said this, is like things are only valuable or expensive because time is finite, and you want to get rich because one day you're going to die, so like time is finite. So like one way to just make things more accessible, more cheaper is just basically once you expand lifetimes, right? Like suddenly like you're in a less of a rush to make all of these things happen, right? Like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, maybe people died when they were like 60-ish, like that was a life expectancy. Now people live hopefully into their 80s in most cases. So, people get to have more richer lives. And the expensive things also like goes down as you get as lifetime as the lifespan expands. So yeah, just wanted to throw that in.
I agree. I think it would bring a whole new level of presence, clarity, freedom to wonder. Like, I would love to learn Japanese and Korean. And my life is just too busy at the moment. Yeah, I think that would be a true net improvement to humanity.
No, that's amazing. So to wrap up, we have like some fire round questions, Olivier. Like, and we love these. So you can give like a 20-30 second answer. If you want to go longer, feel free to. But an underrated researcher everyone should be following on Twitter.
Michel Pokras. Michel is the GOAT. Michel is the person I know that is probably the best at the intersection of research and engineering. Michel is someone who has an extreme level of empathy and care for customers and can go, pull the craziest, engineering and research initiatives to make that happen. mission progress was a big driver behind GPT-5.
So your favorite AI product beside ChatGPT?
I think I have to say Cursor at the moment. I have to say Cursor, like, it made me love coding again. I was getting, especially with some kind of coding, I was getting frustrated. Like, I was not spending enough time. It's not my day job anymore. And so whenever I was popping up, like, my terminal to do some weekend project, all the dependencies and like having to relearn, like, etc. Like, oh my gosh, like it's too much. Cursor has made, like, for me, like weekend projects like fun again.
How do you stay updated in the AI space with so much happening all the time?
That is probably the AGI complete like question at the moment. So much noise. I try to stay off Twitter as much as I can, which is really hard. And instead, follow like a few specific publications, and frankly talk to like researchers and engineers at OpenAI.
Any research paper you would recommend, like you recently read, you're like, hey, it's very critical for people to read who are interested in this?
Oh, I still come back to the O1, like the first like reasoning paper by OpenAI. The mechanics of the chain of thoughts. I think it's pretty deep, and we are scratching the surface on what reasoning can do.
One recent advice you got, which you were like, hey, that was really insightful.
No one knows what your future is going to be, and we constantly underestimate how much agency we have individually to make it happen.
And the last one, like, what advice would you leave developers building on OpenAI with?
I think 2024 was kind of slow progress-wise, which is insane to say given what happened last year. I think you can safely assume that the rate of progress of models is going to remain the same or increase in the coming year. And therefore, bet on progress. That's what's setting you apart from the established, slower companies. Like, you can have conviction in the future.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Olivier. This is amazing. I think this was a great recording. You were an amazing guest.
Thank you so much, guys.